Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you're listening from. Welcome to the Change Management Simplified podcast, where we will explain and discuss what change management is really about, using real examples alongside principles of change management based on our experiences on projects, transformations, change initiatives, and of course, the home experiences as well. Hi, welcome back to the Change Management podcast, and it's me, Rachel, your host, who is passionate. Was a word that I received from one of my colleagues. Passionate about change, but really my passion comes from the challenges and the frustrations that I face or have faced on projects over the last 15 years. And again, the purpose for me doing and the motivation for me doing this podcast is really to share my experiences and for you to avoid the same pitfalls done by other leaders or transformational leads, but also for any change practitioners there to keep in mind. And the question that I have in front of me is that I received from one of the listeners was, why is stakeholder management important, and why not? Why and how do you go about it? Um, Firstly, you need to understand what stakeholder is or stakeholder management is. This can also be referred to as stakeholder engagement. So, by the time we finish this episode, you will understand why. Firstly, you need to break those two words. Stakeholder is a person who has stake or is interested or impacted in the project or the change initiative that you are conducting. And therefore, you need to keep them informed, you need to manage the expectations, and you need to deliver what they expect to ensure that it's fit for purpose. So really, what are you doing? Uh, why do you do it? It's just because, simply to be honest, it's because you're changing the norm. And when it comes to changing the norm, people are a very complicated creature. We're simple but complicated. You hear me say that because I do work a lot with people on change. Um, but that's because they have to adopt to something new. You're changing their way of working. And unfortunately, as human beings, we don't like to change. And this is why I personally think we end up having all these regulatory impositions by the regulators to change the way we do business or we write business, but also the government imposing and putting laws that we have to follow. Fine, that's okay. So long as it's for the greater good. So, what is it really about when you add the management word and you have the stakeholder management? It's really about really engaging and taking the impacted stakeholders on the journey with you. And when we go through the episode, you'll understand how you can take the stakeholder on this journey. And this is where I'll answer the second part in terms of how do you go about managing stakeholders or stakeholder management. Because at the end of the day, I have seen people broken in their careers uh, or made a success in their career because of how they manage their stakeholders. And therefore, that means stakeholder management is a critical and an essential skill set that you need to be able to be successful in completing a transformation project or any type of role that, because the higher you go, the more you have to manage your stakeholders. These stakeholders could be your peers, your employees, your team. So everyone around you is your stakeholder. Even at home, you've got stakeholders, you've got children, but at different age groups. How you manage a 5-year-old is very different to how you manage a teenager. How you communicate with them very differently. So as we go through the episode, you'll see why this is the case. So how do you go about managing your stakeholders? First and foremost, there are 4 parts to this. The first part is what. What are you changing? You need to know what are you changing. And then secondly, you need to know why. Why the change? What's the purpose? What's the objective of this change? If you get to, this is core because you have to use this knowledge want to get inner motivation and engaged yourself into this change, but also because you have to sell it to other people to be able to engage them and give you that ongoing support through the transformation or the change initiative. If you are unable to convince them about this change, which it's actually very easily done because some people just take on the role, think they'll just deliver something and that's it, and forget that actually that change impacts people, and therefore you have to take these people on the journey, which means as a starting point you need to convince them why this change is good for them. And then that takes us to the third point, which is who.
Now, if you find this podcast beneficial and interesting to listen to, do me a favor, please press follow and subscribe and share with your friends and families.
You need to understand your stakeholders and their needs. Who are these people? Who's impacted? Even if it's not people, even if it's an automated factory, which function of the factory, of the machine has to be, for example, be changed or to be improved? There are stakeholders, unfortunately, as well. So you need to think about how you do the transition from the old machine to the new machine. How do I go about this? Um, I usually personally use the SIPOC analysis, but you can do this via the PESO analysis. I will do a separate episode on the PESO analysis for those Spotify subscribers. But today, focusing on an internal project. Um, use the, I personally like to use the SIPOC analysis. This is a Lean Six Sigma terminology or principle, and I'm going to credit Craig Hoggart, who introduced me to this principle, or to Lean Six Sigma, which I've also gone on then to use in change management as well. SIPOC meaning standing for suppliers, inputters, processors, outputs, and customers. If you follow those four components, they will push you, or they will enable you, one, to identify your suppliers. Who's supplying the system, for example, for implementing a new system? Who are those stakeholders? The external, for example, maybe it's SAP plus our internal IT team. Those two have to connect, they have to work together. How do you engage them and interact with them? Then two inputters, where are the inputs coming from? Where's this data coming from that needs to go into that system to be able to then flow into the outputs? Then we have the processes. Processes. What is the data flow? What are the handshakes? What is the process for each step that then feeds into the customer? The outputs I've mentioned. Who gets the outputs? If we change the layout of a report or the attributes available in the report, does that have an impact on what they do on a day-to-day basis? Why do they even have some of these fields? Do they really need them? Those are those are all this that is one of the biggest groups. And if you get it wrong on that group, plus the customer group, ooh, you are in deep trouble because you're not going to go anywhere. And I'll give you a classic example. There was a project we had going, SAP rollout globally, global massive financial service company. And the HQ up in the US decided to scope out their requirements for SAP rollout, global rollout, but there was little involvement from the local countries or the regions in scoping out these the requirements. In the end, HQ decided to aggregate some data, take out some attributes that they previously had, without consideration of why some of these attributes or data inputs are required by the local stroke regional teams. And then they decide, once they scoped out their requirements, configured the system as well, strangely enough, then they push it out for UAT to the regions and to the local countries. The local countries looked at it and said, that's not fit for purpose. I need this set of data for a local regulatory turn. Where do I get this data from now? Where is my old report that I had? It gave me everything. But however, someone wanting to make quick decisions because they felt they had the power, They disregarded the inputs, the impact on the customers, the inputs or the outputs that the customers needed. And in this case, it was the finance team. So you want to avoid such scenarios, because when that happened, that project was supposed to be a 4-year rollout, SAP rollout program. It's ended up being rolled out in 10 years. And actually, it was an MVP at the end of it, just a minimum viable product. And they spend so much money, so much time on it. It's just unbelievable. But this is what happens. We had so many CFOs leave, so many transformation leads leave because of the same program, because they could never get it right, because they started off wrong. They never involved the stakeholders from the very beginning. They didn't engage them because someone at the top, HQ, makes the decision. HQ, you need to think about your approach. The other piece that you want to do is when you want to do an impact assessment. Through the impact assessment, you will actually understand how each stakeholder group needs to be kept satisfied, how you monitor them in terms of their change curve, and then how you keep them informed. The frequency of it. Is it via email? Is it interactive Q&A sessions? Do you just team meetings? How do you want to do that? What we did have on one of the projects was we'll get the sponsor come and have a small session with us, the project team, where we actually raised some of the concerns or some of the issues, but also shared progress, and also they gave feedback, and that gave us an opportunity to share what we did, but also we acknowledged that this sponsor was actually interested in how we're doing this project, and they're available for us when we needed their support or guidance. The other piece, it will allow you to know how you can engage and consult, but it will push you to continuously engage with these stakeholders and take them on the journey with you. So that's, and that leads into the next step, which is around stakeholder engagement. It's important for you to acknowledge each stakeholder is not the same. So if you think how you manage the EC or the project steering committees the same way you're going to manage your peers or impacted team leads, you've got another thing coming, because the team leads are more interested, or the impacted team leads are more interested in the details, because at the end of the day, they're the ones who have to inherit this, the outputs of this. So it's in their best interest that you deliver what they expect and to make sure that it's fit for purpose. The EC or the project steering committee, usually those people on there, only one would know. However, even then, it will be, maybe if it's a finance project, it will be the CFO. But they don't know the details, because they get high-level outputs from the team leads that are being impacted, who have to do the groundwork to it. So you need to adapt each way of how you communicate and engage with the stakeholders to the stakeholder group. And this goes back to your impact assessment. How do you keep them satisfied? How do you keep them informed? What are their needs? What's in it for them? You need to always remember that when you're engaging with them. And therefore, not one size fits all. The other thing you have to do is actually put a plan and a strategy how you're going to engage them, each group of stakeholders. And remember, a plan is different from a strategy. If anyone is in doubt of that, let me know. Happy to do an episode. But several people confuse the plan for a strategy. Two different things. But put it into practice. And at the same time, don't hesitate to adapt it to the phase of the project or the progress of the project, because you have to be agile as well. As much as the stakeholders going through that change, the project is also going through the change, going through different phases of the project. Adapt that strategy and the planned activities to that stage, because that's the only way you'll get real-time feedback and be able to deliver the appropriate messages to that current status, to the current needs, to the current concerns. So it's okay for a plan not to go for, a stakeholder management or stakeholder engagement plan not to be the same as what it was 6 months ago. That's absolutely normal. And there's nothing wrong with that, because at the end of the day, your stakeholder dictates how you communicate to them, not you. Now, the stakeholder's got more power. an influence about how you communicate and engage with them. Interact with them. Create the time. Don't just have a plan or full of SharePoint updates and newsletter emails and maybe and a town hall. Find other avenues where they have some interaction with you. You'll be surprised when you give some people a glass of wine. Not that I encourage, this is not me encouraging, senior stakeholders to get their employees drunk, but in a relaxed environment, team drinks or something, or dinners, people in a relaxed environment will honestly give you feedback, constructive feedback, or raise constructive concerns that you can then really listen to. These are messages that are not going to be watered down by your transformational leads. So it's actually good for you that you hear some of this feedback. But that means you can't drink and get drunk. No, we don't want to see you drunk in front of your team. No, no, no. You have to remain not drunk, okay? Because you need to actively listen. Not hear, but actively listen. And remember what you had discussed with your stakeholders, some of the feedback, and think a moment to reflect tomorrow morning on your way back. Actually, this was some good insight. How do I go about adjusting and resolving some of these obstacles? Um, so, yeah, in a nutshell, that's what really stakeholder management is about. And thank you for listening. Next week, for next week's episode, I received a question, which is, who are the most challenging stakeholders I've ever worked with, and how did I overcome that situation? Interesting question. Every stakeholder to me is very different. But there is one particular stakeholder group, which is the internal audit. I'm still struggling with them. And on that note, see you next week, and thank you for listening.
If you find this podcast beneficial or interesting, please press follow, like, or subscribe. Lastly, and of course, don't forget to spread the word by sharing. Thank you for listening.